So how you doing today? We have a special guest today, Dr. Michael Thomas. He's a doctor in finance. He's also the author of the book, Black Financial Culture. So please look out for this. We're going to touch on a lot of the book and some of these concepts. But I think it's going to be a fun conversation. He's a real guy. He's going to be open and genuine. And I think we really need that to kind of move our culture forward. So
Let's go, Uncle Money.
welcome today, Michael.
Yeah, Randall, thanks for having me. And brother, again, I appreciate you sticking with me, even though I told you I was going to follow up with you way back when. So again, thank you. I dropped the ball. You picked it up and you gave me another handoff. So I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
they say in sales, like the secret's always in the follow-up. And I think that
I,
alone lesson could be worth the whole interview there. But to have you on is important. So can you kind of tell a little bit about yourself, your background, and what are you doing today?
yeah. So in terms of background, just professionally, or would you want me?
Yes, correct, fresh.
Okay. Yeah. So professionally, I serve in the financial planning, housing, and consumer economics department at the University of Georgia, more specifically the financial planning program, which is a board certified program. We have undergraduate, master's financial planning, and then doctoral financial planning as well. So we covered a gamut, and so the work that I do primarily is I teach our Wealth One class. I teach our Intro to Personal Finance class, which is a big general electives course, more or less a feeder course into the major for individuals who might be interested. Even though I have to tell them personal finance is very different than once we start talking about wealth and estate planning and tax and retirement planning and all that good stuff. I want you to keep the joy, but I want you to know that there's a lot more work. We got to take a deeper dive. So I teach those courses, and I was actually approved to create a blockchain literacy course. So I've been working on that for about a year, and it got approved last year. So the first iteration was taught last summer, and then I'll be teaching that again this upcoming summer. So that's what I do. The role. I do a lot of public speaking. Um, I do a lot of service work. I really feel like that's where my heart is, more or less, is in a servant in any service space. I kind of think of myself as a servant scholar, so to speak. And that really is my disposition. I'm not I need to be in the front of the group. I can lead if I need to lead. I can fall back if I need to fall back. Really, for me, the most important thing is in the work that we are doing, are we actually getting something done? Can we measure it? Is it producing the fruit that we hope for? And do we have the humility to say that something isn't working and be able to learn lessons from our first go and then to be able to go at it again and to try to do it better? And so for me, that's where my heart is, wherever I am in life or in space, really is just simply to serve and to hopefully to actually move the needle in areas, not I'm doing this or I'm here or I'm there. That doesn't matter if we didn't move the needle. So I'm just more interested in moving the needle work. And yeah, that's where I am, man.
Very cool. I like that. And I met you first time you were giving a lecture, and what you
Mhm.
said really resonated me, motivated me to read your book. So if you definitely have a chance to hear Dr. Thomas speak, it's worth your time. Spot on. Now, you mentioned something moving the needle. And I think a lot of nonprofits, even sometimes academia, definitely in places of faith, they do kind of like the check the box, gain the
Yeah.
numbers. And I understand you have to obtain your grant, you have to justify your actions. But when we talk
Absolutely.
about, as you mentioned, moving the needle, it's long term and sustainability. You don't see that. So, how do you kind of reconcile that in your career? Because you are kind of touching in the nonprofit space, you're directly in academia.
Yeah.
So, how do you feel
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, actually, so the beauty in the role that I currently have is that I have my specific title is lecturer at the University of Georgia. which means that my responsibility basically is to teach my classes and have a little bit of a service component. So unlike other faculty who are tenure track, there are more expectations on them in terms of the publisher parish and all these other different things that come with academia. So because my career that I chose for myself allows for a lot of flexibility, it's created the space for me to be able to write my book, as opposed to thinking if I spend the time working on this effort, this could be a grant opportunity. This could be a publication to a journal that may be an amazing journal. But let's just be honest, maybe only 10 people actually read it. And then of the people who download it, they're probably going to download it to simply just kind of cite something from my paper so that they can include it in their paper. But it doesn't really get any of the wind behind it to actually help it to become something more. So for me personally, that moving the needle piece is creating the space professionally that gives me the flexibility to engage in important conversations, to serve on boards that I want to be a part of, to do things that I think are important in the season that I'm in, to try to do the best work that I can do possible without having to worry about the University of Georgia or some organization saying that I'm not doing these other things that I need to be doing. I have that flexibility in my work. So that gives me the opportunity to explore, to be more creative, to not have the dollars in a way that some of my colleagues may have to, and to ask more interesting questions that I think are important questions that we need to ask, even to begin to collect enough data to begin to actually move the needle. If and unfortunately, status quo is status quo. So if there's the flavor of the month in terms of research, where academics aren't any less, um, what's the right word that I'm looking for? We're just as likely as anyone else to give into our biases, to kind of be focused on where the dollars are coming and looking at research and research questions and journal submissions and things of that nature from a business perspective. You may have a great question, but if that question is not going to get eyeballs, if it's not going to generate dollars, if it's not in vogue, then that great, wonderful question that can actually move the needle may not get the time of day in this particular season, right? So for me, I'm in a space where I just have the flexibility to explore, to play, and oftentimes to ask questions and to engage in ways that maybe others can't because they're bounded by the process that they're navigating, the career track that they've chosen. And I completely understand it, and I don't knock those people for it because you have to create a space for intellectual freedom. Um, and if you're not going to play the game like other people are playing it, you have to also understand that that may mean that you may not be able to bring in certain resources. And so for me personally, I'm not in those ways, thankfully, and it's a blessing in that regard. I have an amazing wife who has an amazing career as well. We have a lot of flexibility in the way that we do things. And honestly, just to be honest with you, Rando, I've been to the bottom multiple times and I've found joy there. I've lived there. You get what I'm saying? I'm not afraid of falling off, if that makes sense, because I'm trying to do something that I think that's impactful or that's important. So I just have a very different disposition, but I've also created the space for my flexibility.
I think that's important because when you choose a career, you are sometimes bound in ways you don't expect. So,
Yes.
me as a registered investment advisor, I'm bound by FINRA. There's some things I
Yes.
can't say. If you are a tenure track professor, you are bound by your ambitions within the education system. Speak on that a little bit because you speak to students and you're preparing them for careers. Like, talk about the decisions of how you decided not to be bound in the way that you were not bound, and how students have to actually think about that.
Yeah, and actually, this is a thing. There, we first it's important to understand that we navigate systems. That's the it's no different than when someone first learns about compound interest, right? And exponentiating growth. It's a system dynamic, or whether we're talking about inflation and we start to connect that to monetary policy, right? And what the Fed is doing. That's a system. Like inflation or deflation isn't necessarily just randomly happening all the time, but there can actually be systematic things or forces. The issue is that oftentimes, especially if you come from a background like I come from, I'm from Gary, Indiana. Um, the only other cousin that I know of that graduated from college at the time was about 12 years older than I was. And I didn't really know her well at all growing up. So I kind of felt like I too was a first generational college student and just navigating the process because I didn't really know until after I started attending college that she had. When navigating that process, you're navigating a system. How do you navigate financial aid? How do you express agency and ask for more money? Do you even know that you can ask for more money? Right? Internships or work study and where you get your work study and how that can actually set you up for more opportunities. So if you do this, you want to do this here, right? Every step of the way, there's the explicit and there's the implicit. The issue with students and our educational system is that we create hierarchical relationships every step of the way, right? And what happens is that students are at a power disadvantage and they don't know how to navigate the dynamics of power that are going to present themselves when they do, especially once they become a professional, because the game changes. The hierarchical standard when you're navigating education is that people tell you what you need to do, right? You take my class, you get a syllabus. Now, the system within that is that do you understand what a well-written paper is, right? Formatting, how you collect and gather your thoughts, whether you're using APA or whatever it may be in terms of all these different elements, in terms of how you cite your sources, how you communicate to a professor, and how you get more like there's the assignment, but then there are people who have come into that process who've been coached up in that process. When you get here, you get this. This is what the paper needs to look like. This is how you format it. This is a 5 paragraph essay. This is how you like, this is how you, right? So even then, there's a system of the explicit and the implicit, right? Once you get into the workforce, unfortunately, what happens is that there's still that power construct, but nobody really tells you how to be successful. And then tell you what the cost of success is. Explicit, implicit. And we automatically assume that these new graduates know what they're signing up for in terms of quality of life, in terms of physical, emotional, psychological health that comes with the grind of entrepreneurship, that comes with the grind of the pursuit of the corner office. Gives you a corner office just to sit in that office. They give you that office to work in that office, and you're probably going to be working a lot. The relational dynamics of balancing relationship and work and family life. Can I create boundaries? Can I not create boundaries? What issues can I speak up on? What issues can I not speak up on? You have white culture, you have black culture. If you're working in an all white space, you got to understand sensibilities of white culture, right? Middle class dynamics, upper middle class social codes and dynamics, wealthy social codes and dynamics. How do you begin to navigate those things? So to get to your point, though, in terms of navigating this, with my students, I incorporate systems understanding in my lectures because you cannot be successful as a professional if you don't understand the system working with wealthy individuals or upper middle class individuals. You have to understand decorum. You have to understand rapport. You have to understand how to navigate space. You have to understand how to work a room. You have to understand how to dine. You have to understand like all these different things. And if you don't understand these things and nobody's coached you up on them, you're going to, especially if you don't come from wealth, it's very easy to feel as if I don't belong. And it's not that you don't belong, it's just that you don't understand the game that you're playing. And so for me, that you as a graduating student, unless you come from a family who's navigated that space, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And that's why mentors are incredibly important. However, oftentimes mentor programs are not thoughtfully designed. They're kind of created to kind of fill the void and to say that we're mentoring, but we're not effectively engaging in a space of addressing our implicit biases that we're not actually communicating. And oftentimes it's because the organization doesn't want to address those things because that's the hard work. That's the actual looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying that we're not actually doing everything right. It's not you. This isn't us thing, but that takes too much work. It's easier to allow people to come in, wash out, and bring other people on. And the people who stick are the people who already understood how to navigate the system. It wasn't that they were better than another individual. So for me, in order to close that gap, every time I teach my classes, as we talk about wealth, let's say we're talking about passive versus active investment strategies. I tell students all the time, even if you have a desire for active investing strategies, if you're interviewing with a firm, do your research and you know what their position is. You do not go into that interview telling them that, oh yeah, I want to engage in active management and I want to do X, Y, and Z. They're already going to say this is not a fit. And we don't even want to risk bringing you in for us to train you, but then you want to do your own thing and communicate these. You know exactly where I'm going with this, friend. Which is why firms usually young talent and not individuals who are always seasoned because they come in with their own mindset. They don't always want to do it the firm's way, right? You know where I'm going with this. So I communicate those things to clients in terms of this is how we actively listen. This is what we're listening for. If you're invited to engage in a conversation that's in alignment with the firm's values and their core beliefs, and it happens to resonate with yours, then go full on in. But if those things have not been bought and you're bringing something to the table that deviates far away from what their core philosophies and beliefs are in terms of their investment philosophy, you don't just randomly bring that up in conversation, right? You keep that in your back pocket. You live to fight another day, right? But if I don't tell them this, they don't know. And they don't know that as soon as they spoke on something, even if they were passionate and incredibly knowledgeable, may not have been the right circumstance or situation to do that. So when I teach, I also talk about social codes. I talk about financial planning firms. I talk about the inner workings of what this actually looks like. So these amazing students that I have, some coming from rural Georgia, some coming from Southwest Atlanta, some coming from just a wide range of backgrounds, can already start cultivating the skill set of the soft skills, or what I like to call essential skills, that are necessary when it just comes to cultivating, developing, and maintaining relationships in the space. So for me, that's always the big piece. It's that they don't know what they don't know. There's no way that they're going to know what they don't know. Once they start working, most people aren't going to tell them. And then what happens is that they end up leaving the firm or the profession thinking that there's something wrong with them. There was never anything wrong with you. You just didn't receive the coaching. I learned the hard way. The difference for me is, though, is that I was able to learn quickly and I was able to adjust on the fly. I was like, okay, that's how we play the game, right? It wasn't about me being black or anything like that and me navigating white spaces. It was just like, this is how the game is played. If I want to stick around, I need to understand that this is how the game, this is how we have to play it. Because actually, nobody's being treated any differently than I am.
Yeah.
It's just that they're navigating it with a different mindset because they understand the constructs of the game. And their agenda is to get to where they want to get to. And so I had to learn it quickly. But I always told myself that if I had an opportunity to give back, this is the area where I will give back. And that's what I've been doing in the classroom to close that gap.
Yeah, I think that's amazing because I remember when I was in college and I was talking to somebody. He said, Randall, do you realize when you graduate, you're going to be competing with people from Tech, people from UGA, people from different colleges, different backgrounds, and you don't understand just the people you sit in your class with are not really your competition. The knowledge that
Facts.
you're getting in the school is not really what you need to know or your employers need to know. So my question for you on this, and after this we'll get into your background, but I think this is
Yeah, yeah.
important stuff. The when does that knowledge ideally need to be disseminated? What age range is this going to be something that needs to be done over the dinner table?
Yeah.
Is it even fair for colleges to be telling us this? Because sometimes you may feel like you were sold a poor bill of goods. I know a lot of people in my generation, they look at their student loan debt and they say, what did I
Yeah.
receive? So talk about when you receive that knowledge, and then we'll go into your background. I think that's a good transition.
Yeah. Honestly, this is a struggle, Randall. Maybe we work on a co-book about this at some point in time, co-author book, right? Is that generally speaking, I think that these things need to be established around middle school, quite honestly. Understanding that there are social codes, there are social norms. In a Black community, we would call it switching, right? We would say that, hey, if I go into one environment and another, I'm code switching. But we say it sometimes in a way to where it's uniquely a Black or white thing, but it's not a Black or white thing. We code switch all the time. So if I'm talking to my friends a certain way, and my grandmother comes over,
Mhm.
right? We're going to engage with my friends are going to change their behaviors. They're going to have a different respect, love, the way that they communicate, the way that they engage, right? It's going to be completely different. That in essence is code switching because we're actually respecting the space of someone else. We always do it. This is not a Black or white thing. And so when we understand that to navigate different spaces, we in essence got a code switch and we've been doing it all of our lives, then it's easier to think about it in terms of navigating, let's say, a predominantly white space without feeling that I'm violating some level of my Blackness, right? Then therein creates dissonance, right? It's case in point. Um, let's say there's this young lady that you're interested in and you want to ask her out for a date,
Yeah.
right? And let's say that you usually don't shave, you don't put on cologne, you don't do you code switch real quick. You know what I'm talking?
Yep.
You start writing poems. You ain't never wrote a poem in your life. You like chat GPT, help me to rhyme these words together real quick. You're code switching, right? But it's not, but I use code switch to normalize it in a way because we do these things to navigate certain spaces if we have an agenda. And we already intuitively know what we need to do to improve our chances of success. And that's in essence what we're doing, right? So when I say in middle school, because that's where notions of self, where do I fit in with my friend group, where do I fit in within a world around seventh grade, definitely eighth grade year, is so incredibly important to understand that like our identities are literally on the spectrum,
Yeah.
right? We're not individual who's a box and who's only one thing. And you can actually explore these different sensibilities that actually calls for you to have to navigate different spaces. So you like art. Well, if you're in high school and you're hanging out with your art friends and you're going to art class and you're geeking out over X, Y, and Z, you may not engage with your friends who love hip hop and rap music and things of that nature the same way as you would with your art friends. This is just a more complex understanding of self that you're not just one thing. And I think that that's so incredibly important at that middle grade era, that middle grade space, is to say that my identity of Blackness, even more specifically, is a very complex and evolved and sophisticated way of being. And I think it's elegant and it's beautiful. It's not I'm selling out. Think about it. When we think about individuals who are even today culturally, who are, let's say, thespians or musicians or doing anything in arts, I'm going to be honest with you, Randall. If you were growing up in my neighborhood in Gary, Indiana, during the 90s, during gang culture, talking about, I want to go act, you were not accepted. Talking about, I want to go, and most of my friends who did that stuff and who had gone on and have done extraordinary things, oftentimes I didn't even know that they were doing these things. Right? You're going on a weekend. Where are you going? Yeah, well, me and my family, we're just leaving. Like you didn't even know that I was navigating spaces with individuals who had all these amazing talents, but they were not accepted in the system that we were navigating. Because if you weren't a gangster disciple, vice lord, or whatever it may be, it didn't really matter at that point in time. Right. So to be able to have that conversation around the dining room table to talk about identity and how Black identity is so much more than this narrow perspective of, let's just say, hip hop culture per se, I think creates the space to give people the freedom
Hmm.
to say that I enjoy photography and not to think that there's anything deficient about it. Randall, how backwards is that? For a kid who's an artist, a musician, or wanted to go into photography or X, Y, and Z, to feel as if that there is something wrong with them because they can't identify with their culture. What it does is that it bounds us.
Yes.
It causes for us to have very narrow perspectives of the world, and those limiting beliefs and creating this false level of dissonance just permeates itself in academia, professionally, and otherwise, because we've never been given the freedom to actually explore outside of those confines of what we'll generally attribute as Black culture. And that's limiting. So that's where the conversation has to start. If it starts there, what it allows is for people to reflect their identity, their notions of Blackness in much broader ways than we've allowed for them to. And I literally believe that if we can do that fundamentally, everything else takes care of itself. Right? Because you have the self-esteem and confidence to know that, hey, I've done this, I do this, I enjoy my passions here, I enjoy this. And as I'm exploring life, it's something to be explored. It's something to glean insights, to learn, and to come into greater fulfillment of self. I think that that's beautiful. And so that's where the conversation, I believe, starts. And that's kind of how I kind of laid that out. It's having also a family culture that can receive you, right? Especially if you have unique talents and abilities, because that creates dissonance within the family as well. Because then they're also by perceptions of identity X, Y, and Z. And it can be considered soft or weak or X, Y, and Z. And that individual can literally hide their talents. And that's where the issue is for me. And if we can expand that piece of it, I think everything else takes care of itself.
I think that's important because it allows you to be not just one person. I think us in Black culture, we're folks, so folks don't be one type of Black male, strong, quiet, confident, have a lot of swag. Well,
Yeah,
some
yeah,
of us can be writers, some of us can be dancers, some of us can be business people. And I think of all the, historical people we think about that we admire, they were artists, they were astronomers, they were
yep,
scientists, they was inventors. They had the privilege, and it is a privilege, to be able to
yeah,
think out and try different things. Um,
yeah.
So let's transition a little bit more to your background. Can you kind of explain, your upbringing? Let's talk about before high school. What type of child were you? Like, what was happening in your life around that time?
Yeah, so I was a pretty quiet child. I was very observant, quite honestly. I didn't grow up around a lot of family initially. My dad was a Marine, so we traveled a little bit early on, which honestly I think is probably the reason why I'm here where I am now today. Because my earliest memories weren't of just growing up in Gary, Indiana, and that's all I knew was Gary, Indiana at the time. So my first memories are in Honolulu, Hawaii. That's where we were stationed. So I'm at the beach. I'm in the sand. I'm like just mellow, just chill, like really beach culture. That is me. Like if I could afford to buy a plot of land in Hawaii and build and live there, I would, like that is me all day. Just very simple. I love nothing more than just being on the water and just hearing the ocean, watching the waves. Like I can do that all day and not get tired of it. So that was that. Then we moved to North Carolina for about a year and a half, and then we moved to Gary, Indiana. So early pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, up to about second grade. Then we moved back to Gary. So I went from predominantly white spaces to now predominantly black city. That was very different than living on a military base. The culture, military culture is just very different. And so moving to Gary was the first time where I was actually exposed to black culture in the way that I'd exposed, where I had to deal with it in a very different way. And so I was just very quiet. People would tell me all the time that I was different. I didn't necessarily know what that meant, but I was just always different. So I struggled with feeling different within a context of navigating the spaces that I was navigating. Believe it or not, I really struggled with school. I probably should have been held back probably like two or three times. uh, yeah, I was that kid second, third, fourth grade, just kind of in the back of the room, head down, not doing my homework. I didn't understand it. I struggled with it. And when I was doing homework, my parents struggled with me doing homework. We would be up to like one or two. We would literally start like 4 o'clock and be up to like 1 or 2 in the morning, working on the same stuff. And then they would get frustrated and all these other different things. So school wasn't fun for me. But then also on the flip side of it, with a lot of my older cousins and aunts and uncles that I looked up to, I also noticed that there was a lot of use, a lot of alcoholism that was transpiring um, within family. I also noticed drugs and how drugs can completely deteriorate the body of somebody very quickly. Our neighbor, I saw that happen with our next door neighbor. Her husband had gotten locked up for something, and then she ended up engaging in a relationship with one of the local dope boys. And then clearly she was, and literally within about 3 or 6 months, she looked completely than she had looked prior to. And then after that, I saw very similar things happen with aunts uh, and all these other different things and cousins who were dealing and from so for me in my worldview at that time was that there was nothing about that was right to me, right? And yeah, that's I guess that's where that spirit of me that comes from in terms of being okay with being down at the bottom, and knowing that you can have an amazing life even though you don't have excesses and all these other different things if you choose to live it that way. But then also to know that you also have a you don't have to go and sell the same type of stuff. You don't have to go buy and sell to your neighborhood and cause the same deterioration that you're seeing in your family. Um, and for me, that was never an option. And so once I got to fifth grade, the light bulb came on. And in academics, and it was my teacher, Miss Hernandez. I was in love with that woman. She, she was my teacher. I was in love with Miss Hernandez. She was my motivation that year. Like I learned my multiplications, I learned my division. I learned everything that I needed. She was, yeah, it was Miss Hernandez. That's what it was. So after Miss Hernandez and navigating that space, I started to really engage with academics a lot more. It also helped that being smart and then also being fairly decent with sports. So I played baseball, ended up playing baseball through high school and then some of college. So I didn't get the same stigma that some of my other peers did for being smart because I was also playing sports as well. And so that was kind of like my transition, fifth grade, academics, sports, and then just kind of riding that up. And then at a certain point, my mom always said that, hey, you're going to go to college. She never told me how I was going to or what the process was going to be or anything like that. It was just that you're going to go to college. So when that came around, oddly enough, all the schools in Gary had lost their accreditation except for our school the year before. So we were put on probation, but all the other schools had lost their accreditation.
Mhm.
And so there was that issue in terms of whether or not folks were going to even accept my and things of that nature from the school. But, you know, God willing, I was still able to navigate that. Ended up coming down to Georgia, attended LaGrange College in LaGrange, Georgia. And then while there, started to fancy things like accounting and business and all that jazz. And literally that's kind of what's kind of propelled me on from there. But that's my upbringing. And it was baseball, a lot of baseball. I spent all my time at the field. Every spare moment that I had, I was playing school. And if it wasn't school, I had my cousins, and we'd play video games and stuff like that. But I'm not going to say that I was in the streets or anything like that. All my older cousins had done that before me. Why would I do exactly what they had done? And then it was the same time. You do whatever. People think you're the man. You got the jewels, you got the car, you got X, Y, and Z. Then you get locked up, and it's almost like you're forgotten.
Yeah.
Like nobody talks about you, nobody visits you, nobody says anything about you. And then 15 or 20 years, you get out and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, welcome back." And nobody was thinking. It's almost like you are invisible to everybody once you get locked up. And I saw it happen over and over and over and over again. And I was like, there's nothing about any of this that is appealing to me. I was like, I would rather not have.
Now let's talk about that in reference to Black culture, because I think your books talks
Yeah.
about it. My dad tells me all the time, like, hey, in the early 80s, we as a culture were making progress. Affirmative action would happen. You know, Jimmy Carter just got out, put a whole bunch of cultural programs into place. You know, we were getting jobs, learning IT skills, things of that nature. And then, of course, it kind of hit us with the whole crack epidemic and then three strikes. Kind of explain your perspective of that, because I think you maybe have seen it a little bit closer, you're a little older at that time. What was happening, you know, the true deterioration of our culture, which led into gangster rap, like kind of give that timeline as it associates with your, you know, becoming of age.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in 83. Uh, what was fascinating to me in terms of how this is just how I perceive things is that the 70s, latter part of 60s, definitely into 70s, going to the 80s, we were kind of at this inflection point, right? If we go back and actually look at the media and what types of things were being propagated as Black culture, especially in the 70s, there was a lot of pimp and whole type dynamic. And forgive me for lack of a better word, but that was kind of like the culture, right? So this notion of being a pimp, being X, Y, and Z. So for me, as I'm growing up, I'm seeing more of this party life, this aspiration of like Superfly and all these other different things as being a predominant way of thinking and being, and what's being reflected in what I'm seeing around me. Not to the extent of the 70s, mid to late 80s per se. But this whole idea, this fixation on this aspirational perception of being a pimp, but not being the pimp, with the car that you drive, the clothes that you wear, the way that we treat women, the misogyny, the love it. I didn't have I didn't have healthy conversations about male female relationships growing up. I'm not even going to go into what those conversations were during that time, but it was not anything healthy whatsoever. And so for me, I kind of that those cultural dynamics to me were the more prevailing cultural dynamics that I saw outside of, because the alternative where I was that if you're not hustling, if you're not in the streets, so you're working at the steel mill. Right. So we're in Gary at the steel mill, and the steel mill industry is still booming right now. So this means that individuals who get a job at the mill, if they're willing to work doubles and, just so many different hours and swing shifts and things of that nature, you can make a decent middle class living. But that other dynamic of drug culture and these notions about these ideals or hyper masculinity and things of that nature were also in the backdrop too. So those were those competing forces. And literally, what ended up transpiring was that as the steel mill started to decline, and then people started to leave, and we started to see white flight and all these other different things that were happening in Gary. For me, what I started to see was more of the dominance of gang culture, drug culture, and all these other different things manifesting themselves. And individuals still trying to idealize these perceptions of Black masculinity
Mhm.
that was the ideal pimp.
All right.
Honestly, it wasn't masculinity in terms of what I saw growing up, wasn't rooted in being a doctor, wasn't rooted in being a lawyer, wasn't rooted in being an engineer, even though that there were individuals like that in various parts of our community. So I got to see a variety of that. What I existed in was more of the former as opposed to the latter. And so, and what's unfortunate is that ideally we still fantasize about these things in our culture and our music and our film and X, Y, and Z. And people then say that these things, it's harmless, it's just entertainment. Um, but no, it's marketing. And what we believe, what people believe about us, or what others around the world may perceive of us, comes uniquely from what they see, the portrayals they see of us in film, television, and music. That literally is the expectation. And if you're not that, you kind of throw people off a little bit in that regard, especially people outside of the states. So that's the way I've perceived that in terms of my coming up. And then definitely with the 70s, drug culture was really, really big in that regard. Um, and then once we get into the 80s, it's a very fascinating thing. And I would need to go back and explore this a little bit more. But we do have three strikes. We have drug culture, we have massive poverty and things of that nature. And the biggest issue for me revolving or stemming outside of that kind of goes back to Martin Luther King's book, his last book, like Where Do We Go From Here? Um, which is an incredibly powerful read. So if you haven't read it, I want to encourage you to read it. But the major issue though is that crime, drugs, any of the social ills of society um, were pegged to the Black identity as well. No different than, it's almost like we're scapegoating this thing on the Black community, even though that these things were prevalent in other communities as well. No different than if we were to talk about racism. we kind of scapegoat racism to being a uniquely Southern thing. But historically, racism wasn't bounded to the Southern states.
Not even America.
Um, right, not even America. So this notion of we kind of tether and attach things to a group to identify, to externalize, so that the greater whole could feel better about itself and not necessarily recognize that we're all dealing with the same issues. And it's not a Black issue, it's a poverty issue. And unless we address the poverty issue, you're always going to see the same type of social ills manifest itself, whether Black, white, Asian, Hispanic culture, Indian culture, Irish culture, we can go all the way around the world. Poverty manifests itself in a very similar way. Um, However, during those times, I don't think that we were necessarily in a space coming out of the Civil Rights Act um, to really have these more nuanced conversations, um, helpful conversations. And I think that if we could revisit, of course, hindsight is 50-50, that we would be in a much better place as a nation in terms of engaging in real reconciliation and real healing from historical wounds. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, that's good. So you're in college and you decided to be accountant. Another
Mhm.
thing, my first when I first declared a major was accounting, I switched to finance. But another thing in our culture that isn't sexy. So what made you decide accounting? You could have, you know, not even been in business. You could have, do social work. You could have done all these other things. What about accounting appealed to you?
Yeah, it's the numbers, quite honestly. If I'll be honest with you, I like numbers. I think numbers are fairly objective. They tell a story, and there's a lot you can glean from the numbers. So for me, at the end of the day, it was I like numbers. Um, I'm fairly decent at this. You can make good money graduating with an accountant degree. So for me, like that's all that I needed. And literally, I'm primarily thinking about I can graduate in 4 years and I can have an immediate positive impact on my family in some way by starting a career in this particular space. I wasn't thinking about what other people were doing, any of my peers were doing. I've always been a little bit of a loner in that regard, which is probably why I didn't navigate some of the things that I could have navigated in my youth. And I just did what I thought was the best thing for me in that moment. So I wish I had some other thing, right? But at the end of the day, if one of the things that I learned very early on is that money talks. The issue, though, is that when you can't get to the finish line to secure the bag, per se, then the money doesn't have an opportunity to speak,
Yeah.
right? So, for instance, if you have a kid who said, "Oh, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to get this degree," but they never finish, and they go back home and they never go back to school because they owe the institution X, Y, and Z money. And because I owe the institution, I can't get my financial records released. Now I'm kind of stuck in this other system of things. And then family just looks at it and says, "See, we told you so." There's no money to talk. All you have is student loan debt, and you don't agree to show for it. Everybody's gone and everybody's come back home. I don't know why we keep going to begin with. You see what I'm saying? And that becomes socialization at some point in time. And then we stop nudging and encouraging. So by me finishing and me working and making money, now people can say, "Oh, I see it now."
Right.
Right? And it's no different. It's like if you had someone who's a dope dealer who's out here selling dope risk, but they're not making any money. Nobody would want to be a dope dealer. It would look foolish,
Right.
right? But if you got the car, if you got the clean clothes, if you got the nice apartment, People are like, oh, I want what you got. It's no different than if you're an accountant. Like nobody cares that you're an accountant if they can see outward displays of wealth. And it leads to a pathway. And it says, oh, you can do that in 4 years, or maybe I can get a 2 year and start this process. X, Y, and Z. I can see the bag. I can see the money. And when you're coming from a background or a system where people are constantly struggling with lack, right? That becomes a powerful force in the short term, not sustainable long term, because you still have to deal with psychological, emotional healing, and all these other different things. But in the short term, it deals with the notions of lack. And then that becomes normalized. And then we realize that, oh, the money wasn't enough because I still have these other emotions and these other feelings and these other things that we're dealing with, or these new expenses, right? And it doesn't stop. So that was the big thing for me. It was just showing that by finishing, making the resources and money, people can actually now see that this is a pathway that does lead to an end that is going to be financially beneficial, degree or regardless of the degree.
Yeah.
So the
So,
money,
you know,
not the
so you decided, so I work with a lot of doctors. And one thing that I've kind of noticed about doctors is almost like a legacy thing. They could be in a different field of study, but people who have doctorates, parents or somebody in their family usually had a doctorate because the amount of time it takes, the
yeah.
foregoing income, things of that nature. So what triggered you to get your doctorate? Because I'm assuming you didn't have that similar support, let's say that.
Yeah, very, that's a keen observation in terms of there is this legacy dynamic because in essence it becomes normalized. You don't look at becoming a doctor as a long drawn out process. And because you come from family who are doctors, generally they have the financial resources to address any financial shocks you may experience along the way while pursuing your doctoral degree, which makes it easier for you to navigate the entirety of the process. That financial shock piece is so vital and makes it very difficult for individuals who don't have family backing as they're pursuing these. As I kind of touched on in my book, um, the way that I did this was my wife and I were kind of swinging with regards to she would pursue a degree and then I would take care of things. And then I would pursue X and then she would take care of things. And it was like the pendulum. We were both supporting each other in our own professional growth. We were our support system. Without one another, I'm not sure if we would have been able to. I'm not sure if I can literally say that I would have a degree right now without my wife. I'm just going to be honest with you. And us and her supporting me um, in a process that is a very long and drawn out process can feel isolating and a lone process. And her still working through that so that I can see it through to the finish line. Like there's no way I would have done this without my wife. But that being said, when I went back to get my master's degree, initially I wasn't thinking about financial, I wasn't thinking about a doctoral degree. I didn't even, in my mind, to your point,
Mhm.
I never saw myself as having a doctorate or feeling worthy
Mhm.
of having a doctorate. Like, who am I? Right? I'm a kid from Gary, Indiana, that grew up during a time where we were in the top three of murder capital per capita in the United States several years. Didn't come from necessarily a school, like I just told you, like with our school system and all these different things. What am I doing here? Right? I didn't necessarily know or feel as if I belonged, to be honest with you. And I still struggle with that a little bit. But I love math. Hey, it is what it is. So I ended up pursuing a master's degree at the University of Georgia, financial planning. Um, and I did the thesis track. And I was the only person that did the thesis track, which required you to take statistics and all these other different things. So as I'm taking these classes, I'm in the classes with all of the PhD students. I'm not in any of the classes with any of the other students in my cohort because of the statistics requirement. And as I'm taking these classes and I'm working with them, Aman, who graduated years ago, would always tell me, he was like, "Hey, Mike," he was like, "you should really look at seeing if you could transition into a PhD program. I think you can do it." It's like you're already doing everything that we're doing, and you actually do your reading and your homework. Like if you put in all this work, you might well. So actually, it was Aman who really kept nudging me, and then a few other people as well. And then I reached out and I said, "Hey, would it be possible for me to do this?" And they said, "Well, if you do X, Y, and Z," and I went through the process, and I was able to transition from the master's program into the PhD program. And then that's where that transition happened. It wasn't me going into the saying that I'm going to be a PhD, be a PhD. Literally, I was called into that next step. And I'm incredibly thankful that I did answer that call because it's led to so many amazing opportunities. Whether I felt like I was worthy of the call or not, I still walked into it. And because of it, again, I've been able to engage in a lot of meaningful work that I don't think that I've been able to otherwise.
So I think one thing that is not mentioned, and because I'm a financial planner, I'm in so many different households, I kind of get to watch the dynamics of couples. And
Mhm.
what's not spoken on a lot is there is a seesaw in
Yeah.
any marriage that has lasted more than 10 years of financials. Like there's going to be a time, and I'm sure you tell your students, you're going to time you're going to be unemployed. It's going to be
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
time where you're not going to be making as much as you used to. We think it's a nice line, but
Yeah.
kind of give that kind of relationship dynamic. Like, were you able to one find your what? Well, you said you was a seesaw, so you were working then going to school. So
Mhm.
how did you have that discussion with your wife? I think that's important. How did you navigate there's okay, you agree to it, but when I'm in it, it feels different.
Yeah. And I'll be honest with you. Um, my wife she's more of a risk than I am.
Mhm.
So she's always ready to go. Like literally. Like that's just her personality. She's always willing to try something new and to jump into things, whatever it may be. The difference, though, is that I'm usually the one who's always counting all the cost, right? And so when Ashley was willing to jump into this, one, it was just going to be masters, and then we did PhD, which she was supportive of. But I didn't do a good job of being able to communicate the costs because even I didn't understand all of the cost associated with navigating the process.
Those are those
So
symptoms you were talking about. Nobody
yeah,
told you how to get there.
yeah, and I think that in those moments, with mature eyes and a mature heart, it is incredibly unfair in relationship dynamics to me to say that if somebody's feeling some type of way,
Yeah.
to say that, oh, well, you said you were going to support me,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the issue with that statement though is, but did I said I was going to support you, but I am now starting to feel the weight and toll of this journey that we're navigating that I did not have the capacity to fully understand before we went on this journey. It's no different than, let's say you go to a dealership and they sell you a vehicle and it's a lemon, but you don't ask any questions. You don't get the vehicle checked. You don't do any of that. You just think that, all right, I'm about to get this great deal. And I drive off the lot.
Yep, yep.
And then the car breaks down 3 days later. You're going to go back to that dealership and say, hey, I want a refund because you sold me a car. And if they looked at you and said, well, you signed the contract, you know how that feels, right? Everybody would know how that instinctively feels. I didn't sign up for this, right? And so what happens is because one person is just more focused on what they're going and what they're trying to achieve and what this may mean to their family, and they don't want to stop the journey. And the other person is kind of like, we need to slow down and talk about this because we may need to adjust some things because this isn't working for me at this point because now I'm taking on a bigger toll.
Mhm.
And it's unfair for this person to tell this person that it's not okay to feel the way that you feel,
Yeah.
right? And and in that, I think a lot of conflict happens, especially professionally, if you're an entrepreneur, X, Y, and Z. And what I've learned is that if we can effectively communicate our true needs, our true whys collectively, and then find grace and balance and symmetry in the process, which may mean that on my side, I'm going to have to say no to a few things. And that's okay too, because you got to learn how to set boundaries here. And if you never learn how to set boundaries here, you will always be grinding, you will always be working, you will always be in another project, and there will be no end. And on this side, you're losing something, right? And this person could be losing a sense of identity and all these other different things because it's being warped into. So being able to more effectively have healthy conversations about needs and knowing that this is not an indictment on anyone and that these feelings are real and someone can have space and capacity to feel these things, then we can just create better systems about what we need to do to navigate this successfully. But then also to be thinking about, well, on this end, do I really need to be doing everything that I'm doing? Really? You get what I'm saying? Or is there something that's made up in my mind saying I need to be on all these
Yeah.
things? But do I have to be? Probably not. You can let some of that stuff go and create more space and time. So what happens is that when we can create a dynamic to be able to receive those emotions and those feelings and healthy conversations, we can actually realign, reassess, better communicate what's coming ahead, and then thinking about how we can create pockets of space through all of that as a little bit of reprieve. Maybe it's after every 2 months, we'll take a week, do X, Y, and Z, right? You can create wins, and that's something that we had to learn how to do, not taking things personally, not feeling attacked in the process. Because as a man, you're wanting to provide, you're wanting to create a better lifestyle, you want to do all these different things. And that becomes, that for us is, we're locked in,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But when you're in a relationship, those things are good for your partner, but then also quality time is incredibly important. Being present, planning things, being on top of things at home. Because what I had to learn the hard way was I was giving a level of intention and proactiveness to my work that I was not giving at home.
Yeah.
And then so we had to learn how to work through and manage that. And I had to grow through that process. I'm not going to sit here and sugarcoat anything and lie to you about that. That's something that I had to grow through and continue to be very clear about saying no, and making sure that I'm prioritizing things that are family related just as much as I'm prioritizing things that are work related and even the pursuit of my PhD.
And I think that's tough. I'm married, so I completely understand every single word that you said. But also, I think it's hard for the younger generation coming up because Instagram was kind of around when we were early on in our marriage,
Yeah.
but they have so many cultural expectations put on them. If you're not making so
Yeah.
much, you're a failure. If your wife isn't able to do this, you're
Jesus.
horrible. Um,
It's ridiculous.
and so kind of speak on that as far as when we talk about Black culture,
Yeah.
that has a direct effect on the finances. Uh,
It does.
Delta's making record profits while our net worth is going down. Like, kind of speak on that
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah, again, this goes back to the numbers.
Mm,
The power of social media. is that it can make an instant moment feel as if it's everything. No context, no nuance, no reality. If we look at the data, if I'm not mistaken, the average household earns around maybe 45, $46,000 a year. Ballpark range, don't quote me on that, but it's ballpark range. But yet, if I'm on Instagram and I'm watching a video and somebody is, you know how they do those videos where they come up and say, well, how much should your man be making right out of college? Well, at least 100,000, at least 150. I'm just saying, like, they got to live up to my lifestyle. But I was like, the reality is that a very small percentage of people are making $100,000 a year. That's not, there isn't this significant swath of people that are making six figures, right? And so there's there's reality,
Yep.
and then there's this perception of reality that's just completely off base. Um, there was this watching something the other day. Can't remember. It's two famous people, and there was this gentleman, right? And he sells like Birkin bags and all these like really, really expensive bags. And one of the guys says, who can actually afford these bags? He was like, I'm gonna level with you. It's only people who have money to waste. It's not everyday people coming to buy what I'm selling. It's people who have the discretionary cash flow where they can do away with 50 or $60,000 in a bag and not think about it. Like my clientele aren't the people that you're seeing on social media, even though it's marketed that way, right? But that's not the reality of who the consumer is of these products or goods. It's Jay-Z said it best. He creates aspirational music.
Mhm. Mhm.
Everything that we so that paradigm of new marketing culture is all about aspirational sense of identity and wealth and prestige. Now, mind you, these things have always been around. They just haven't been on social media. When I grew up, it was lifestyles of the rich and famous. Used to come on early in the morning. And I would get up and I would watch that show, and you would see these people living in these mansions and driving these cars and X, Y, and Z. This isn't a new paradigm. The issue is that it's everywhere, constantly,
Mhm.
every moment of every day. That show was only on for maybe 30 minutes or an hour in the wee hours of the morning. Everybody else is after that, people are at work, and once they get off work, family, sleep, or whatever it may be. But now the same messages, those same themes, make it seem as if the reality of life is that everybody is walking around here making $100,000. Even I have to college students, right?
Yep.
And my frustration with this is that if you go to high schools, you'll see these posters on the wall that says average starting salary of a college graduate, 65 or $70,000. And then I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about there's no context, there's no nuance in this conversation. We're not talking about what region you're living in and what are the pay expectations based on cost of living. We're not thinking about degrees and impact of degree selection on, right, like how much you're going to be earning outside of school and all these other different things. So we're already actually anchoring students to this perception of just because I got a degree, I should be afforded said lifestyle because ballpark range, I should be making X. But that's not the reality because there's no nuance and there's no context. So we do this in school systems with flyers about average salaries that have no context, no
Mhm.
reality. Social media, no context, no reality. We don't have conversations or open conversations about money and actual pay of households and whether or not I'm financing my lifestyle with income or if I'm financing my lifestyle with debt or if it's a combination of the two. Or maybe, I've had a client, gentleman, 40 years old, and was like, hey, you know what? I want to do this on my own. I was like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean you want to do this on your own? It's like, well, my grandmother, she's been paying for everything.
Mhm.
Not technically an inheritance, though. That's not a jab at anybody or anyone, right? But notions of welfare are either public or private. The only welfare we talk about is public welfare. We don't talk about private welfare that comes from a considerable amount of wealth, where you can have a kid who is launching and isn't paying any of their expenses until they're 30 or until they settle down, they're ready to have a family. That's real stuff that happens in the real world. So long story short, in terms of like just kind of navigating, and I forgot where I was going with that. I'm sorry, Randall.
We were talking
I
about
lost
social media.
Yeah, with the social media, it makes it seem as if everybody is in the same boat with the same amount of money and are earning X regardless of whatever career it is that they have. That's just not the reality. So for me, one of the things that I do in my class is that I actually have students, we go to payscale.com.
Mhm.
I have them go on and look at their major. We look at early salary of major on an annual basis. We then multiply that by 70%. So you're going to keep 70% of that reasonably, the rest coming out for taxes. Now that's your annualized amount. Then we divide that by 12, and then we get it all the way down to a monthly or biweekly. And I ask everyone, based on the lifestyle that you have in your mind,
Yes.
does this make sense to you? Because you can already start to live it before you live it based on the data and information that we have. If you're graduating in 4 years, let's do a time value money calculation. Let's increase that over a 4 year period to kind of estimate what your salary may be around that time. We see those trends, and it will work the same process. And then at the back end of the year, what I have them do is a future forecasting assignment where they go and they basically have a model of a spending plan or budget. And they basically have to go in and do research and fill in every line item as it relates to their future expenses. And then they also then bring in their future income,
Mhm.
take home pay, coupled with that to then kind of estimate where they're going to be off into the future based on the choices that they're making right now. Because your present is your future self as well. Everything that you do now is impacting your future. And then my question to them is that if there's something that you don't desire in this picture, you have the time to do something about it now.
It's powerful.
And then they have to create a plan
Yeah.
for what they want to do while they're in college to better prepare themselves future self that they have coming. So we address it.
I think that's important. And I think, like you had mentioned, that calculation probably should be done in middle school. How do
Yes.
I prepare myself in the eighth grade to live the life that I want to live?
Yep.
And
Time.
really, that takes another step back in the study of systems. Because me and you, we both know people who make really well off,
Mm-hmm.
but are they happy? People miss that
Yeah.
aspect of it. You can make a
Yep. Yep.
six-figure, $200,000 income, but there is a sacrifice, similar to that sacrifice of a corner office. There is something to that. Now,
Yeah.
you decided to have your doctorate in financial planning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Culturally, we don't talk about financial planning. Very, especially when you probably got your doctorate. What made you decide to study that area versus any other area, finance or accounting? Why that specific area?
Yeah. Quite honestly, I'm for me, it's everything. It's about having honest conversations about the wealth gap. And for me, that's always kind of been the angle for me, so to speak. It's how can we do research to actually move the needle? And you can't move the needle unless you actually find the source or root cause of the issue. And so I figured, well, if navigating this process is about providing the research necessary to gain the ears of individuals who are policymakers, who are donors, who are organizations that want to strive to have an impact, then maybe this is a better use of my time with regards to asking different questions, so that we don't continue to do the same things over and over again, expecting a different result. And partially, that's the conversation around financial literacy. I'm an advocate of financial literacy. I'm an advocate of financial capability. Different areas. The issue though for me is that, well, how do you, in conjunction with literacy and capability, help individuals create the space necessary, to be able to navigate things and to do them over the extended period of time that's necessary to have financial stability. And if you're already navigating a world where you're only, let's say, $30,000, $27,000, $32,000 a year, and costs keep going up, like you don't care if the contribution in 2024 for a Roth IRA contribution went up. You don't care because this is the thing. Most people aren't maxing out the Roth IRA anyway. Most people aren't maxing out the 401k. But in our spaces, people talk about this as if this is par for the course and it's normal. This is not reality for the vast majority of people. And the vast majority of people either don't have access to a 401k, or if they do have a 401k, don't feel as if they have the capacity to contribute that much to it anyway, right? So what are we talking about here? Are we really talking about financial literacy, or are we really talking about that the vast majority of Americans are in a position where the reality is that regardless of how much they save, it doesn't matter. If I contribute to a 401k, but I'm constantly dealing with financial shocks and I have to go and raid those accounts, or family member is sick and it's my responsibility to help take care of my family, but I'm always going to put my family above and beyond this future nest egg of something because culturally this matters more to me than this other thing that you're talking about. I would say that that person is making a decision that's in the best interest of his or her family as they see it at that point in time. It doesn't mean that they're financially illiterate. It doesn't mean that they don't know that they need to save. It doesn't mean that they don't know that they need insurance. Because the vast majority of these people do know that they need these things or they should do more. Now, mind you, there are going to be some people who are very hedonistic. They don't care. They're just living life, whatever it may be. But everybody isn't in that same bucket on that spectrum of individuals who aren't saved or who are not making contributions to retirement. There was something that came out not too long ago that said roughly 50% of Americans don't have anything saved for retirement. And this is the thing. Saving for retirement is that having the capacity to save for retirement is a privilege. It is a upper middle class privilege because saving for retirement means that one, you have to have the capacity to save. And then over a long period of time, you have to have the level of financial stability that you never feel like you will ever have to go in and pull money out of those savings for something that's important, right? And we don't talk about these other elements and creating other mechanisms of people to effectively move closer towards financial stability and then also having something off into the future. And so for me, like the whole idea of navigating this space is thinking creatively, thinking differently, and saying, well, maybe the way that we've always done it doesn't work the same way for everyone based on level of socioeconomic status. What we do instead is we say, regardless of socioeconomic status, if you just grind it out, you just grit it out, if you do X, Y, and Z, no context, no nuance, that you'll too be able to be a millionaire. If that's the case, then why is it that we don't have as many millionaires as we claim? It's not reality. It's not rooted in data. And even when I look at studies where people say, oh, Dave Ramsey interviewed all these people who were millionaires. You know, nobody ever talks about like what were the degree choices, what career field these individuals work in. Whenever you hear people like call in and they say like we're debt free, so what do you do? Yeah, I'm an engineer and my wife's a doctor, and we were able to pay off everything within 7 months. Yeah, you have the cash flow to do it.
Stayed healthy throughout those months as well.
It's exactly. And so what we do is we put everybody in the same bucket
Mhm.
and say everyone use the same strategy and you should be able to make it too. That's just not how, and you as someone who works in this space, you know that when you work with clients, there's context, there's nuance, there's behavioral things, there's different goals and desires, there's all these different things that you're navigating. You don't say everybody who comes work with me, I'm going to give you the exact same plan. And if you just stick to the exact same plan, you're going to achieve your goals and have financial well-being and feel fulfilled and all these different things. It doesn't work that way. So if it does work that way in the financial services space when we advise clients, why do we recommend the same package, rote, canned response and say, if everybody just does this, we all win? When that's not the case when we work in the professional services space. We know inherently there's more to this than that, right? And so for me, that research piece is incredibly important because I am not afraid to ask these questions and then to consider, well, how could we pursue this in a way where we can to bring a newer narrative into the space, and that's where I'm aiming with my work as I continue to move forward.
So I think what you're alluding to, if we want to increase wealth, our savings for retirement in America, it's not create a new Roth account. It's not creating a Roth 401k. That's not the magic pill or the silver bullet. It needs to
Yeah.
be something more systematic, going down
Yes.
to the root of why people um, one don't trust the system to save and
Yep.
allow them to save. I like
Yeah, because otherwise you can't be consistent. Consistency is the only thing that compounds.
wow.
Compound interest doesn't do anything if you can't consistently stay in a market. There's no magic to compound interest without consistency. So if we don't have individual, like you're saying, like individuals either they don't trust the markets for whatever reason, and I can get it, because based on the feeds and social media and things of that nature, it can be fear, doom and gloom, FUD, um, fear, uncertainty, doubt one moment, and it can be the markets are going to moon, right? Everybody needs to get in, and it creates this roller coaster ride. And because people never engaged with this, they don't know how to self-regulate their emotions. They don't know that they're navigating a system or tools that are created to encourage them to be emotionally volatile, because Robinhood and other platforms don't make money if you aren't constantly trading. Same concept, because back in the day, when certain advisors, right, would be managing someone's portfolio, they would engage in something called churning, right? That engage in a constant selling and buying of securities. Why? Not because it was always best for the client, but because that's how they made their money, buying and selling. But what's fascinating is that we have somehow convinced an entire population of individuals that churning is actually a good thing for them when it's not a good thing, because you don't even really understand the markets and you're buying and selling outside of yields are up, yields are down, and I see a red line going down, I need to sell. And then now I see that this other thing is trending, I need to buy it. And then you repeat the same process. We are literally raising an entire generation of individuals who will be able to say, yes, I'm investing. But access does not equal success. Have you developed the appropriate behaviors and habits to be an effective investor is a more important question to me than are you investing for your future? What does that even mean? Right? There's so yes, I am 100% where you are as it relates to why people aren't doing. And for me, I like to focus more on that behavioral side of it. And then behavior, and then can we create more effective systems or better strategies, federally and otherwise, to create more space and opportunity to ensure that people have dignity in retirement. Maybe it's a, maybe it's, if someone's in a situation to where reasonably they don't feel as if they can catch up with savings, maybe there's an alternative to Social Security or something like that that has greater flexibility, um, that could be set aside for individuals to have this supplemental amount where they can have enough discretionary income today to meet their needs, but then also have this other money that's off to the side that's grown in conjunction with their Social Security that will give them a little bit more so they can have dignity today and day. I don't know what the solution is, but putting the onus completely on an individual who has to navigate the markets, that has to navigate the world and its volatility, and to assume that individuals who are the lowest levels of socioeconomic status are going to have the capacity to ideally do the things that we talk about, that's literally more so for individuals who are upper middle class families that have the stability to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I don't know. I struggle with it. And there has to be a better way to navigate this process. And for me, and I'm going to be very clear here, Randall, I'm not concerned about the wealth gap. I'm just concerned about creating wealth.
Yeah.
And so for me, because the conversations around reparations and things of that nature, especially at this point in time, are so politically contentious on so many different ways. And what it does to me is that it breeds a level of false hope
Yes.
to be able to receive said resources that would maybe um, have some favorable impact on communities today based on things that have happened in the past. The issue, though, and you and I both know this, is that someone who is receiving a windfall of money without being prepped and primed, nurtured, educated, supported, that money will flow right into our community and flow right back out of our community within. Some people will manage it and do well if something like that were to happen. But I don't think in a long run that the impact would be as significant as we think that it might be in that regard. One. Two, because oftentimes I think that conversations about reparation breeds false hope, meaning that I'm not going to tap into my agency in such a way to create a new reality, regardless of what may happen. So it kind of keeps us in this holding pattern a little bit emotionally, psychologically, and even financially, in that we think about things. And I struggle with that. Anybody who's ever run a race, if you're running and you're trying to run somebody down who's ahead of you, but no matter what you do, it feels like they just keep getting further and further and further. What happens psychologically and mentally to that individual?
Get a little demoralized.
You become demoralized. And it's like, why even try? Because no matter what I do, I can't catch up. So what this person does is when that happens mentally, it actually affects the entire body. You actually start running slower. You're not trying to win a race. You're not trying to get your personal record, even if you were on personal record pace, because you were so focused on that individual who was ahead of you. And I don't have any control of that person right now, that I don't even get my personal best because I'm demoralized because I'm focused on this individual. So what would happen if, as an individual or as a community, that we said, and I'm not saying that I'm necessarily for this, but if as a community, at some point in time, we said that, you know what, forget the reparations thing.
Mhm.
Let's just completely do away with the conversation of reparations. In fact, anything that I build, anything that I achieve, anything that X, Y, and Z, I'm going to take him. And in knowing that, I engaged in a process, I created it, I built it, X, Y, and Z, and I'm creating generational wealth for me and my family. That's not tethered to, yet again, somebody saying that they gave me something.
Yeah.
Because we have to think about the circular loop here, right? Because then the argument is that, oh, if African Americans do well because of something like reparations, what then happens is that it then gives credence to people to be able to say that the only reason you were able to come up is because you received X, Y, and Z. And who did you receive it from? You get what I'm saying? And then we have these types of conversations, and this thing never ends in terms of, I think what African Americans really want more than anything else is just to be respected and to be viewed as in Langston Hughes would say, I too am American, right? And so I get the notion of that, but what if we just stop thinking about that and just start talking about what are wealth habits, point blank, period? And let's just focus on encouraging and nudging people to develop wealth habits where they are with what they have that's sustainable. And then not think about wealth in isolation, but think about it as a collective.
Yeah.
So if we were to say, right, because now you get to see the magnitude of everyone's effort, even though mine's isn't that big, but collective, I feel like I've contributed to something bigger. It triggers the dopamine hit. You want to keep doing it because you can actually feel yourself winning. And then eventually, as yours grows, the collective grows, but you feel your individual growth and the collective growth one and the same. But as long as we keep focusing on this growing, because this is the thing, if we're trying to close a wealth gap,
Mhm.
and then people who have money are investing their money, buying real estate, having businesses, growing businesses, guess what? Their wealth is exponentiating.
Mhm.
So, how do you close a gap on something that's exponentiating, right? The only thing that can literally happen is a wealth transfer to close a gap of wealth, because otherwise, literally, you can't really close that gap
Nope.
if we're all investing and building and growing wealth. So if we focus on the gap, do we ever really close it? And even if we don't close it, but we have a more wealth than we've ever had before, is that a failure? I don't think so. Right. So there are a lot of different things that I think that conceptually we have to contemplate, think about. My thoughts aren't the only thoughts. I don't think that the way that I think is the right answer to all things. But if we stopped chasing and start saying that, you know what, let's just what we know. Let's do things that are culturally relevant and more in alignment with maybe community dynamic and things, where if that's the case as it relates to Black culture, and
Mhm.
then rethink about and imagine wealth from that type of lens and actually just engage in a process of sustainable wealth creation within Black culture and use that as the litmus test of how much should Black wealth grow this year, not in comparison to somebody else. I'm sorry, making up for 400 years of disenfranchisement and all these other different things that have transpired historically throughout time, that is a heavy toll. However, what we can do is ensure that within the next 2 generations or so,
Mhm.
that we could be much further along than ever before. And that's one thing that I happen to believe is that we are closer to that than ever before. And I think that there's real opportunity there. So with the wealth gap, I try not to focus on that because all I can do is run my race. And I'm going to get more efficient. I'm going to get better at running my race. And if I keep doing that over time, then maybe my best race may be better than somebody else's race. However, I'm not concerned about that other piece right now. There are other people who are going to advocate for reparations or advocate for these other different things. I give them the power. I give them the voice. They have the political. They're lawyers. They understand letter of the word. They understand how to navigate that. Let them own that space and do that space. But in the meantime, how do we run the race? And then how do we get buy-in and understand that there's some considerable impact that comes from it. And that's kind of where I fall on that end.
100%. I think that's important. And there's some other things to that. I think
Yeah.
for anybody who listens, I think a second or two to read a long book, The Wealth of Nations, will really kind of
Mm.
shed some light on like that compounding, how you can rearrange that. But we're not going to, that's a little bit more advanced than
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I would love
One,
to come back.
yeah, we may need to do that. One thing I want to talk about is you have your doctorate.
Mhm.
For those who don't understand what type of doors are opened when you have a doctorate, explain that system because I don't think we are privy to, and some people may have aspirations, but they don't know what really comes with it and the benefits that you have seen throughout your life.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that your doctorate, it helps to change your mindset and how we interact with knowledge.
Okay.
When you have a doctorate, the idea that you are deemed as someone who understands how to engage in a thoughtful, methodologically sound in terms of using data appropriately and correctly way to think about a question, think about the questions that you want to ask, verify whether or not those questions using statistics are actually getting to exactly what you're asking, whether or not the person who is reading the question and answering your survey is going to answer it based on the way that it's been written appropriately and correctly. Um, Being able to effectively think about who's going to be my sample population. How do I randomize this in a way so that I can actually infer meaning from a statistical analysis? And that if I need to have greater representation of certain groups because they're generally underrepresented in the data, how do I do that and navigate that and all these other different things? And then be able to objectively and without bias as much as possible to be able to glean insight from data to get to the truth of a thing, right? To produce knowledge that then people outside of academia can use to advance and improve the lives of others. That is, to me, what is the door that opens up in terms of pursuing your doctoral degree, is that you are entrusted to be able to create inferences around about the world around you that the public and society at large can trust so that they can make informed decisions about how we make the world a better place. To me, that's the most important thing as it relates to it's the trust element that comes with individuals who have good intentions and are trying to do good with the knowledge that we create. Beyond that, then people start to view you as an expert in a particular domain or a particular area. So you'll be a subject matter expert. Things that I look at, empathy, compassion, data visualization, things of that nature, and how it impacts consumer choice, behaviors. Those are things that are of interest to me, right? And then also looking at different elements as it relates to socioeconomic status, especially lower SES. And when you find individuals who have greater levels of financial well-being and satisfaction and are sticking to a spending plan or budget but they're in lower rungs of SES, what's different about this group of people than other people who aren't doing those things? So those are the questions I like to ask. Who are the outliers in spaces where we don't expect to necessarily always to see these patterns or behaviors emerge? And then why are they doing these things? Right? And say, oh, we understand this. And now we can start to say, how do we create interventions to create more of this within this pockets of a group of individuals? And then so once you become an expert, it gives you the opportunity to be able to speak knowledgeably on topics to the federal government, to major organizations, to news outlets, both popular outlets and traditional media, so on and so forth, where you can then go and share the good news about the amazing research that you're doing and how it ultimately impacts the lives of others. But it provides a level of credibility that gets you into doors that historically hasn't always gotten people into doors. And so those are some of the really, really cool things about it. The last thing is that there's a certain respect level that with it because it is a grind to pursue and to be able to get your doctoral degree. It can take 5, 6, 7 years for individuals to navigate the process, depending on what they're pursuing. But I would argue, Randall, that it's no different than someone sitting for and preparing for the CFA. Um, I know what that process looks like. I am brave enough to navigate that, but you did. So I know we're talking about this side of it, but I want to commend you on that accomplishment and so many others, because there's a level of focus, there's a level of consistency, there's a level of study and preparation that many people don't want to subject themselves to navigate the process. And because of that, right? There is that level of respect because people know the work that goes into it. And so that's a really, really cool feeling. For me, however, it's not a power dynamic though. It's not a power dynamic play. I generally don't introduce myself as Dr. Thomas or PhD or X, Y, and Z, because I don't like having hierarchical relationships with people. My relationships that we're on even playing fields. And you are expert in your domain in areas of life that I am not. And we can all grow and benefit from a relationship with one another. And but for people who like to lean into that, there could be benefits there as well.
Yeah, I can see that. But I think you explained it well. I think the authority, people outside thinking you know, have the knowledge, but also you respect the knowledge enough to get your doctor, I think is important.
We're gonna build our community back.